This week we will be looking at the history of human rights, a relatively recent phenomenon. Before the 18th century, there was virtually no mention of human rights that belonged to every person. In many nations, slavery and serfdom and other gross violations were common. Women were seen as having very limited rights, and rulers were able to wage war or commit atrocities without any worry about repercussions. Today's world is quite different. Currently in the Middle East, where the United States recently threatened to take military action against the Syrian government because it used poisonous gas against its own citizens, is an example of an international concern about human rights. In the United Nations, there's frequent discussion about the responsibility to protect, or RTP, indicating that member nations are willing to impose sanction or send troops because of violations of human rights. But that is getting ahead of ourselves. Before we can discuss the idea of human rights that has developed in the last 300 years, we need to look at the role of genocide in human history. The word genocide refers to the mass killing of a group of people and was coined by a Polish lawyer named Raphael Lemkin, who wondered during World War II why we put people on trial and punish them for the murder of one person, but take no action against individuals or groups that murdered thousands or even millions. No one knows when the first genocide occurred. There are references in the Bible to whole cities being wiped out as the children of Israel occupied Palestine. One of the most famous early examples of genocide took place in the North African city of Carthage, where the Romans killed most of the population, enslaved many of the survivors, and destroyed the city, salting the fields so that Carthage would never recover. In the Middle Ages, two Mongolian rulers, Genghis Khan and Tamerlane, swept through Central Asia, wiping out or absorbing whole people groups. We are aware of no condemnations of these two feared leaders for their actions, as their power was intimidating. During the exploration and conquest of the Americas, most of the indigenous people were wiped out by the Europeans by war and more commonly disease. It is estimated that 90% of the residents of the Caribbean islands were dead within 50 years of the arrival of Christopher Columbus in 1492. As more and more Europeans arrived in North and South America, the Indian population decreased in tremendous numbers. Beginning with the arrival of slaves in the New World in the 1600s, another horrible example of mass killing took place. Beginning with their capture in Africa and then during the Middle Passage across the Atlantic Ocean, and finally while working on sugar, rice, and tobacco plantations, Africans died in huge numbers. Opposition to the brutality of the slave trade, though occasionally mentioned by religious groups and reformers, did not become common until the 1830s, when the British government outlawed the slave trade throughout the British Empire. Other examples of genocidal behavior occurred in the 19th century, but it was not until the 20th century that a string of brutal, large-scale genocides took place. Southwest Africa, Armenia, Central Europe, China, Rwanda, and Cambodia all witnessed massive killings. The charts on page 5 and 6 of Crimes Against Humanity text summarize many of these genocides. You should review them just to get a sense of the enormity of these killings through history. So when did people start criticizing the practice of mass murders and begin punishing the perpetrators of these crimes, as takes place today through non-governmental organizations like Human Rights Watch and judicial forums such as the International Criminal Court? While individuals have preached against injustice almost as long as tyrants have ruled, and many religious traditions developed principles of morality and justice, it really wasn't until the 17th century that the concept of human rights began to be articulated. One early proponent of human rights was Roger Williams, a Puritan who lived in the Massachusetts Bay and Rhode Island colonies in the 1630s. Williams felt that religious and political leaders should not have any influence or control over the religion of individuals, that every person had the right to his or her own beliefs. Later in that century, the English philosopher John Locke developed the idea that governments derive their power and authority from the consent of those they governed. This is an important idea, not just for democracy, but also for human rights, as it indicates individuals have rights that rulers and governments need to respect. The American Revolution in the last quarter of the 18th century also helped produce important human rights themes. Both Thomas Paine in Common Sense and Thomas Jefferson in the Declaration of Independence warned that tyrants need to respect the rights of common folk. Most famously, Jefferson wrote in the Declaration, "All men are created equal and endowed by their Creator with certain inalienable rights, including life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness." That phrase, perhaps the most impactful one ever written by an American, inspired people around the world to resist injustice and seek democracy. The next important source of human rights emerged during the French Revolution. It's interesting to note that all three revolutions, the English Glorious Revolution in the 1680s, the American in the 1770s, and the French in the 1780s, advanced the concept of human rights. The French National Assembly identified rights held by all people in the Declaration of the Rights of Man. By the 19th century, the term human rights was used for the first time. In the United States, the reform movements that had developed in the 1830s attempted to protect individual rights and change laws. Most focused on the abolition of slavery, though the rights of women, prisoners, and children were also topics of concern in the U.S. and other nations of the world, particularly in the nations that had established democracies. In fact, there's a direct correlation between democracy and human rights. Also in the 19th century, the first Geneva Conventions were written. These developed fair rules of war and measures to protect the injured, prisoners, and civilians. They later included weapons that were not acceptable, such as poison gas and biological elements. Though not every organization and nation has agreed to follow the rules of the Geneva Convention, they have served as a check on human rights abuses during time of war. The 20th century witnessed the worst genocides in history, the most famous being the Holocaust that began in Germany and then spread through much of Europe, though millions were also killed in other regions of the world. But in the 20th century, there also emerged a sense of collective responsibility among nations to deal with genocide and other repressive actions. The Nuremberg trials and the Tokyo war crimes trials after World War II identified crimes against humanity, and the courts punished individuals committing these crimes. The United Nations issued the Universal Declaration of Human Rights in 1948, which listed 27 rights that need to be guaranteed to the citizens of every nation of the world. Finally, the International Criminal Court was established in 1992 to punish individuals who are accused of genocide. While only one person has been convicted so far, it is a start. In conclusion, the concept of human rights has a short history. The practice of genocide has a much longer one.